Okay, we've got a lot going on with the U.S. military, changes in risk status. We've also have big risk that is finally getting the mainstream media exposure that it deserves. That is President Joe Biden's mental status. To help me go through this, I have retired Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Colonel Macgregor, thank you for joining me.
Sure, happy to be here.
So, man, the mainstream media is unable to cover for the president. I want to go through that, but first thing I need some help understanding is I'm seeing on Twitter that the Pentagon and the military have heightened their risk level to Charlie, specifically in the European region. What does that mean? Why would the military be on a higher heightened alert?
Well, I haven't seen the instructions that were given, but I do know that soldiers and airmen in Europe have been told to essentially take off their uniforms if they are going off post or off base, and to walk around and be seen in civilian clothes as opposed to uniforms. Now, that usually means there's evidence for threats to American servicemen. And now, who are the threats? That I don't know. Are they worried about attacks by Muslims or Islamists, or are they worried about hostility that some of the Europeans may feel towards us because of our policies in Eastern Ukraine? I have no idea, but any number of those things could be a reason for it.
Okay. I figured there was something, but when I saw that, I was like, okay, wait a minute. I'm getting on with the colonel. I'll try to better understand that. You and I have openly talked about Biden's dementia, the fact that he's not mentally well. Now the whole world knows it. Even Jake Tapper of CNN is telling his audience that he had no idea Biden was struggling so much with his mental health. I don't know if that's a lie or if Jill Biden has really kept him so well sequestered that many people in Washington, D.C. and the media simply didn't know. Either way, Biden is now being thrown under the bus or out into the spotlight. What are your thoughts on this whole situation?
Well, obviously, Jake Tapper has been given permission by his masters to state the obvious. I think that's what's happened. There's nothing new for you and me. What was interesting was how blatant it was during the debate. And of course, my concern has never been Biden per se. He's an empty facade. He's always been an empty suit. It's who's behind him, who's actually running the show. And I think that's a combination of things. I mean, clearly, members of the cabinet, people like Blinken, Mayorkas at Department of Homeland Security, Garland in the Justice Department, Wray at the FBI, they are all part of the cabal that is governing us, calling the shots. But behind them are a number of other people. You know, we don't normally mention them. I don't, but they're unelected either bureaucrats or representatives of billionaire oligarchs, all of whom are trying to drive us in a particular direction in foreign and domestic policy. They've been running the show for a long time. And the problem that people have is that they focus so much on the president, they think, well, if we use the 25th Amendment, we can remove Biden. Okay, what difference is that going to make? The answer is none. What we need is a new government. You know, what this government has weaponized mass migration into the United States against the American people. This government has sponsored people in the Justice Department who are happy to see Americans under assault and under attack in cities and towns across the country by criminals that are being released onto the streets. This is a government that is effectively waging war on everyone and anyone who is like you and I and who believes in anything like Christianity or professes to. And that's the simple truth of the matter. I don't think you need to be too much more complex than that. This government is blatantly nihilistic, atheistic, and seems to think that the greatest threat to this country is, quote unquote, white supremacy. The last I heard that those three guys that are big believers in white supremacy supremacy haven't been able to get back into the telephone booth where they've been hiding out. So I certainly don't see it that way, but you and I are viewed as part of that problem. We are automatically in that category and therefore the enemy.
Yeah.
And that's why people don't trust the FBI. It's why people don't trust the Justice Department. I mean, it's a simple fact of the matter.
Yeah. Is there any chance, you just sparked a thought, if 51 former intelligence people, including the head of the CIA, approved the letter, the acting person, Mike Morrell, you had Antony Blinken asking them to put this letter together in order to cover up the Hunter Biden laptop. Is there common sense or a logical trend that perhaps the CIA is behind running the American government at this point?
Well, again, I think you have to look at the sprinkling of key people, key figures. I mentioned some of them when I spoke about Blinken and Mayorkas, Garland, and Wray. You have to go through the whole federal bureaucracy and the government and identify the individuals that all share those views. You know, they're the people that would like Justice Kagan, as an example, to be in charge of the Supreme Court and legislating from the bench. These people are all birds of a feather, and they all share the same particular outlook. And that outlook puts them into the camp of hating people like us and wanting to destroy us. I think Americans have figured this out. And I think they've decided that they don't like it. So if you can rid the government of Biden, that's not terribly helpful because he's not making the critical decisions anyway. So that's why I talked about hold elections early. Now, the only problem is holding elections early could be done, but the Congress has to vote for it. Well, what is the Congress likely to do? Well, the Congress is bought and paid for. As I say repeatedly, and many have for years, we have the best government money can buy. Why are we waging war in Ukraine? Why are we continuing to ship money and weapon systems over there when that war was lost almost at the very beginning and never had a chance to win anyway? And it was a disastrous decision on our part. Well, why are we now underwriting anything that Mr. Netanyahu wants to undertake in the Middle East? Why are we cheering on war there as well as, war in Ukraine? Why are our borders still open? I mean, I thought it was almost tragic comedy to see or to listen to Director Wray testify that the open border has allowed dangerous Islamist elements into the country. Is that all? I mean, we can't even begin to understand the gravity of that situation. As I said, migration has become WMD in the hands of these people, of the Biden government and of Congress. So who's calling the shots? And why are we being governed this way? None of these things are issues where the American people have necessarily been consulted. When's the last time anybody asked Americans how many people they want to admit to the country that we know nothing about? When's the last time anybody asked the American people whether or not they wanted to wage war all over the Middle East or in Eastern Ukraine? Nobody has. We don't control the government. We're not asked. This is their notion of democracy, which has a great deal more in common with Lenin's notion of democracy than it does with any traditional classical liberalism or Anglo-Saxon democracy.
Yeah. Just not too long ago, Biden was meeting with the other G7 leaders. There was this scene that they're now saying was a cheap fake or a deep fake of Biden getting distracted, wandering off. The prime minister of Italy has to go and bring him back over to the group, over to the crowd. What do you think the other G7 leaders are thinking? Are they thinking it's not our place to tell America what to do? Or do you think inside they're going, holy cows, the America is being led by somebody with dementia. Any thoughts on what the other G7 leaders are thinking?
When you talk about people like Macron or Schultz, for instance, they're part of the globalist ruling class. They've been installed in power with the help and the backing and the money of people like George Soros. They have long pedigrees in the post Second World War environment of adopting and believing in all the lies and ideology that come with being a globalist. We used to call them internationalists when they were Bolsheviks back in 1919 and 1920. Now we call them globalists. Their goal is the same: denationalize the West, essentially crush Western civilization and reshape it into something new. Convert all of us to an amorphous mass of people who are sedated consumers, but have no notion of who and what we are without any national identity. Believe that people are fungible commodities that can be exploited and utilized any way that is necessary for the greater good. Who determines the greater good? Excuse me, the ruling class determines the greater good. What we used to call the dictatorship of the proletariat, the vanguard of the revolution. Who are they? Well, that was Lenin and the Bolsheviks. We're being treated to the same sort of outcome by a new group that sees itself in the same light.
Yeah. One thing that I wanted to get your thoughts on is the president's own sister, Valerie Biden, is now coming forward, and she is accusing Jill Biden of elder abuse, saying, listen, your own pride and ego, your desire to be famous, to be wined and dined and important is getting in the way of America's safety. My brother is not mentally well. He is not fit to run the country. Can the Democrats ignore this anymore? Or is this kind of like how the Democrats had the back of Governor Andrew Cuomo until they couldn't hide it anymore, and then they all turned on him viciously? Are we about to see that happen?
Maybe. I don't know. Frankly, Tucker Carlson said that 2 years ago, talked about elder abuse. That's not new. A lot of us thought that was the case when he was made candidate for president. Now what I thought was really stunning about the debate was that you had two men. One was 79, the other is 80, competing for the presidency. Is that real? That's bizarre. That makes no sense. Is our bench that weak? And I guess it is. I mean, as you look across the people on the Hill at the individuals sitting in the Senate and the House, how many of them would you readily impute presidential abilities to? I don't think very many. I think we're increasingly aware of the fact that these people are in Washington for many reasons, not the least of which is to make themselves millionaires. And they all seem to come out of the place very well heeled. Well, how does that happen? Well, you have to look at the lobbyists. Who are the lobbies? Pharmaceutical industries, foreign lobbies, the Israel lobby, the climate change lobbyists. Just go down the list. There are all sorts of people that are, oil and gas lobbies. They all have money, and they're happy to sort of slip cash under the door to anyone holding political office or running for political office in order to get control of them. And people have tended to say, well, that's fine. There was a gentleman named Buck, I can't remember his first name, who was a congressman from Colorado, came from Westminster, Colorado, outside of Denver. He wrote a book called The Swamp is Deeper Than You Think. And he finally retired and left Congress after a couple of terms because he said you couldn't survive there unless you willingly became part of the corruption machine. Because you, as soon as you arrived, were told that you have to pay X number of dollars on a routine basis to the Republican National Committee, the Democratic National Committee, whichever one you want to choose. And they said, well, I don't have money like that. Where am I going to get it? My constituents can't raise that kind of money. And they'd say, well, that's why you have the lobbyists go out of the back door here and Go down to K Street. There are lots of lobbyists there. They have the money. Get the money you need, and then you give it to us. This has been going on for a while. This is not new. And so we have a government right now that is largely disconnected from reality. Washington is a bubble because the people that live in it are no longer really tied to the American people. Oh, they'll throw a bone occasionally in the direction of somebody who's a constituent. They'll stand up there and say, I brought these benefits, for drug pricing to you, or I brought you a new manufacturing job in a plant that's owned by one of the big five defense corporations, things like that. But in reality, they could care less about the people that they represent. And they will tell you, voters don't win elections, donors do. And they know that if they don't do what the donor wants, the donor will support their adversary, their opponent, and unseat them either in the primary, excuse me, or in the general election. So their attitude is it's either I get into this game and I do what I have to do to stay here, or somebody else will do it. And then over time, it becomes very profitable. They learn how to manipulate this thing. Look at all the insider trading. You could probably indict 80% of the members of the House and the Senate for insider trading at some point. I mean, this information is available to them, and they take advantage of it. And who's prosecuting them? We'd have special prosecutors all over the place, busy until hell freezes over, if we started to dig into what all of these people are up to. So that's why when I said hold elections, the point is let's start over, because what we've got is too rotten to the core to fix. Whereas everybody talks about reform, you can only reform so much. You end up tinkering on the margins in most cases because everybody says, well, it's too difficult to fix things, because it's like an old house. You buy an old house and you've lived in the old house forever. You keep living there, but the thing's falling apart. It's got serious problems. You've got termites in the foundation, termites in the walls, rats in the basement. The heating system doesn't work very well anymore. So you say, I've got to fix this thing. Well, to fix it, it's so old and so rotten, you got to pull out all the rivets. You got to pull everything apart. You got to tear everything out and rebuild this thing from the ground up. That's what we need to do in Washington. I think more and more Americans are realizing it. I've always focused on defense, but it's not just defense. It's the intelligence community falls into the same category. Most of the federal government does. You look at this Department of Agriculture. We were once the world's greatest agrarian power. We've shot ourselves in the foot. We no longer are. We could be again, by the way, in terms of food production. And so if you go to Washington, you look at the Department of Agriculture, these buildings are magnificent. They're huge, and they go for several blocks. But we're not in that business anymore. Yet the whole idea behind redistribution of taxpayer money and cash comes into play. And so the Department of Agriculture that we don't actually need for what it was originally designed is another clearinghouse for cash that's doled out to various key figures, various corporations that are involved in agriculture. Well, the same thing is true in defense. You can go throughout Washington, look at all these federal agencies, and you come away with a conclusion of, do we really need to do all of this? And somebody will say, oh, no, we don't need to do any of it. Well, that's not true. Some of it needs to be done. But if we're going to get it done properly, we're going to fix anything, we're going to have to start over. It's beyond the point of, in my judgment, reforming a lot of things. We really got to start over and build everything from the ground up.
Yeah. I would love for that to be able to happen. You and I both.
Well, look at the Treasury market, the long-term Treasuries, the 10-year Treasury is what I'm talking about. What's happening there? Well, we're inching up. It was a few days ago or a few weeks ago was 4%. Then it's 4.2%. Then it's 4.5%. When it hits 5%, we're done, because we can't service the debt. We're already paying out, $1 trillion out a year for defense. Trillions have to go every year to service the debt. You're going to reach a point where you can't manage it. You can't do it. So then you go to your the people that own your debt, the people that have bought your treasuries, and effectively have been funding the U.S. government, you say, I need to renegotiate the loan, if you will, in terms that the average American can understand. They say, well, you can try and renegotiate it, but what evidence is there that you're going to pay it off? You are negligent. You have mismanaged your finances. You're so deeply in debt. How can you ever recover? Well, then you say, well, I can make changes. Well, what do you want to change? Nobody wants to change anything in Washington because to change something means that you disrupt the money flow. Everybody wants to keep the money going, but you can't. So what are you going to do? You got to cut spending. Cut spending? That's outrageous. That can't be done. We have over 2,000 programs that fall under the sort of broad title of welfare for various people, everything from food stamps to medical support and so forth. How do you deal with that? Well, those 2,000 programs were all originally temporary fixes that all became permanent. They're now entitlements. You're going to cut entitlements? You're going to cut defense? Oh, we can't cut defense. Why not? Well, we have all these enemies outside the country. Do we really? Or are the enemies inside the country? The gate's been open for quite a while. They're already here, and most of them live in Washington, D.C. They're killing us. That's why I said immigration or migration has become a WMD in the hands of our government. You wield it against us, and they love it. Yeah. And they're arrogant. They think they're in power for perpetuity. Just you try to win an election. See how far you get. You know, what have they done? You're turning to each migrant that comes up through the Mexican border and you're saying, here's a 4-digit number. It's part of a Social Security number. And this entitles you to things. And then we change the law and we say under federal law right now that and this happened under Obama, if someone walks in to vote and thinks they're a citizen, then they may vote. There's no provision to prove it. And if you're asked anything, they're telling these migrants, you've got this 4-digit number, tell them to call this in the Social Security Department. They'll call Social Security. Yeah, we have those numbers. They're not citizens, but they'll acknowledge that they were given those numbers. How are you going to hold a free and fair election? You know, these people that are in Washington know the game. They've developed it. They're very skilled at playing it. So you've got a problem. You know, these are people in Washington who are convinced of their moral authority and supremacy to everyone else. In other words, they're there for a reason, to guide us. We don't know what we're doing. We have to be retrained, re-educated, and moved in new directions. Where do you think you got diversity, inclusion, and equity? This has nothing to do with equality before the law, which is a cornerstone. How many decades, some people would say a century or more, has been spent in ensuring equality before the law? We achieved that. That's not good enough. Now we have to create special categories of human beings, just as we have multiple genders now. There's no such thing as a man or a woman. Those are artificial constructs. Now you have queer non-binary, whatever that is. I mean, just go down the list. All this is insanity, but it's codified, and it's now being shoved down our throats because the people in charge know better than we do. And when we question any of this, we're Neanderthals. We're throwbacks to the Middle Ages. We don't understand the new world that we're living in. This is happening in Europe, and it's happening here. In Europe, it's about to go under.
Yeah.
France is the first example. People are about to revolt. They're on the verge of a national revolution. That's just the beginning. And it's going to sweep into Germany and the rest of Europe eventually. Remember the old adage, the Austrian foreign minister Metternich used to say, when Paris sneezes, Europe catches a cold. Okay? Mm-hmm. So Europe will follow. France is leading. It's the bellwether. We're going to have similar experiences here. You know, what are all these strange rules on voting that we have? The French tried absentee voting. The French tried voting online. They finally got rid of all of this business and said, no, you got to show up and vote because the fraud was just out of control. Well, we know that's the case here as well. People will cheat. I mean, there's this thing that we used to talk about, original sin. You know, given the opportunity, human beings will do the wrong thing. So that's why we have laws. If men were angels, they wouldn't need laws. Remember, I think it was James Madison that said that. So we've tinkered with all the legal guidance and the laws that we used to uphold and enforce, and we now don't enforce those. We're enforcing these other things that don't make any sense, that are antithetical to the interests of the American people. So I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if we're really going to have an election. I've said that for a long time. And I'm not for the breakdown of law and order, because once that goes, you're in a lot of trouble. I don't want to see that happen. I don't want to see violence in the streets, because I know where that leads. Anybody who's studied history, even superficially, understands that. But we're not going to get very far with what we've been doing. And I don't see much evidence that this election, if it is held, is going to bring new people to power who are going to do very much that's different. Because you've got to not only look at the candidate, look at who surrounds the candidate.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, a lot of Americans are struggling knowing, how am I going to pay rent? How am I going to afford a house? How am I going to repair my car, my dishwasher, my laundry machine, put food on the table? And yet Biden announces another $2.3 billion heading to Zelensky. Why is the Biden administration unwilling to go to the peace talk tables? And why do they continue to let Zelensky decide when the war ends versus letting NATO say, this war is over, you've lost land, you've lost 500,000+ people, you need to end this thing? Where's the adult in the room now?
Well, first of all the political figures that you're talking about here and in Europe are fugitives from accountability. They've gotten where they are by riding the train. They've been tinkering with the train, tinkering with the locomotive. The locomotive is close to seizing up. It's not performing very well anymore. And the people on the train that you're dragging behind them aren't very happy. The elites are sitting in the dining car enjoying themselves. Everybody else is miserable. Sort of reminds me of that famous scene in Dr. Zhivago, where the Russian elites before the revolution are dining and enjoying themselves, and outside in the streets are the poor Russians singing some sort of hymn, or perhaps it was the Internationale, the International Socialist Hymn, whatever it may have been. And then people are listening, and suddenly Rod Steiger stands up and says, hopefully they'll sing in tune after the revolution. In other words, ha, ha, ha. They were fugitives from accountability. We have lots of fugitives from accountability. It's back to the bubble. And we have a bubble. There's a bubble in Paris. There's a bubble in Berlin. There's a bubble in London. They're not in touch with reality. They are not going to admit mistakes. They're not going to say we were wrong. They're not going to say, look, we didn't perform any strategic analysis. We just decided the Russians were backward and stupid, and that we could bully them, and that we were technologically superior. And we forgot that the Russians were not backward. We forgot that the Russians are real people with a real country, a real nation, and they were going to defend their interests. They weren't going to roll over for the globalists, allow their country to be raped for its resources and its people to be destroyed, its national identity to be ground into dust. That's what's happened in much of the rest of Europe, certainly in Western Europe. Everyone is apologizing for being a nationalist. If you believe in your country and you identify with something and you have values that are consistent with that national identity and culture, well, then there's something wrong with you. You know, the Russians don't buy that argument. This is really a fight between, in many ways, the last nationalist state in Europe with a true underlying national identity and Russian Orthodox culture. Now, there are Muslims in Russia, and they live in areas where they are concentrated and where they are Russian citizens. They are equal before the law, and they are happy to be Russian citizens. But they also see no conflict between being a Muslim and being a Russian nationalist. And that's why you've seen the Chechens fight so effectively in Ukraine. So Putin has managed this very, very well. He understands his people. He understands what motivates men and women. We don't understand our own populations. And our populations are now reaching a point where they're saying we've had enough. And the first to do it demonstrably are the French, which is interesting because we owe so much to France. French culture and civilization as being part of the West. We owe them everything. I mean, they produced remarkable thinkers, remarkable science, technology, mathematics, culture, you name it. They're not the only ones, but they were in the forefront, the vanguard in many ways, coming out of the Middle Ages. So they're rediscovering who they are and what they want to be. The question is, how much longer do we go on before we embark on the same voyage of discovery?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Well, my worry is, you and I grew up in a time where we were taught about the American history, our founding fathers, the good, the bad, and the ugly of becoming the America. But I don't know that the kids in the universities these days are being taught that same thing. It seems they're being taught to hate their country, to expect everything to be handed to them, that they can whine when things are unfair and they'll get their way. I really do worry about this next generation, because I'm only maybe 10 or 15 years ahead of them, but there's such a difference in the way they think compared to my generation.
Well, I'm sure some of your listeners have read Murray's famous book, The Bell Curve, and then more recently, Coming Apart, where he looks at all of these issues and tries to understand them. I think you'd have to go back over the last 40 or 50 years and systematically pick apart all of the profound changes in the educational system and the way we do business that have brought us to this point. My point, simply, as I made at the beginning, is that we've reached the point in virtually every important activity associated with our society where we have to start over. Now, how do we do that? Do we go backwards and try to reanimate what was there? We can do some of that, but we need a new direction, and we need the ability to forge unity in this country. And that's very, very important. We have, at least, according to the people that are involved with the census, at least 52 million people inside the United States right now who are not born in America. That's an enormous number. And remember that one of the major changes that the Obama administration administered or implemented was that you could become an American citizen and live inside the United States, but you don't need to be an American. You can live on your island, whatever it is that you want to be, and that's okay. Well, that's not okay, because multinational, multicultural, multilingual states historically don't do very well. They don't last long. They eventually fall apart. And we can look at all of them: Austria-Hungary, Tsarist Russia, Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union. So we have to get back. We got to figure out, how do we redefine this thing of being an American? And then we have to somehow or another cultivate a sense of service and devotion to the country. The notion of service is almost completely vanished. And I always look at the military academy where I went to school for 4 years, where we have had this notion of duty, honor, country. But at least at the time, there was this profound sense of service that first and foremost came your country, always, and the mission assigned to you by your country. After that, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, or Marines you may command. Last, yourself. Well, we've inverted that now. People are now thinking first and foremost about themselves, and everything else comes second, third, or fourth. I hear that all the time. I don't give a damn. I'm not going to do this, that, or the next thing. You're not going to see me in that. In other words, they don't feel part of the country anymore. Now, poverty always instills a certain amount of devotion to the country and religious zealotry. I hope we don't have to sink to poverty to get there, but that does work. But the point is, we're going to have to forge a new country out of the mess that has been created. That's going to take some time, but it has to happen. And the institutions of governance cannot be reformed. They have to be changed fundamentally. Right now, they're empty facades. That's the point. That's where we started this discussion.
Yeah. I can hear AOC giving a speech. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for yourself.
Yeah. I think that's probably more widespread than we think, but not everywhere. There's a lot more of us left than I think the elites in Washington think. And we're going to discover that in the months ahead, I'm sure. The point is, we've got to pull together and we've got to forge a new path, a new identity. But we've got to focus here at home. See, all these things happening overseas are really distractions. No one in their right mind wants to go to war with us. You know, there's no one who's going to launch a nuclear weapon at the United States because they know the minute they do that, their country is going to be turned into ash. I mean, Putin has said that many times. Said, we don't want a nuclear exchange and we're not going to use a nuclear weapon. But if we're threatened with this, we will respond. And if we both use nuclear weapons, we will all die. And then, of course, he says, with a wry smile, of course, because we're good Orthodox Christians, we'll be martyrs.
Oh.
Well, I'm not interested in martyring anybody, you know, and I don't think most Americans are. But we've created these boogeymen overseas. You know, look at all the Chinese pouring into the United States. Yeah, well, we opened the floodgates. We opened this, thousands of Chinese, or tens of thousands of lots of other people coming in about whom we know nothing. Now, people seem to think that this is an army in waiting that's going to get a secret signal from Beijing and take over. Far from it. Half of those Chinese are wanted by the authorities in China because they were heavily engaged in corruption. The biggest challenge to the Chinese right now is corruption inside their own country. It's always been an issue. Every month, generals and admirals and various directors of enterprises are arrested on corruption charges. You know, they're building ships with cracks in the hulls. They have rocket batteries, missile batteries, where somehow or another the fuel is missing from the rockets and the missiles. Probably sold it off. I mean, this is not Imperial Japan by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah. They are imperialists, but they are capitalist imperialists. They're about business. They're about prosperity. Now, that doesn't make them good or bad. It's just a fact. We're the ones that opened our borders stupidly. Close the borders and send these people home. That's what we've got to do. If we don't do that, we won't survive. That's the simple fact. Now, it doesn't have to be violent. It doesn't have to be ugly. You can tell all of these people, listen, on your way out, if you register with us, you know, when we have a better economy and we're stronger against in terms of our society and our financial situation, we can bring you back. If you register with us on the way out, that indicates that you're willing to obey the law and cooperate. Sure. But if you stay here against the law and we tell you to leave, you're going to be incarcerated and eventually shipped out of the country. We got to go there. There's no other way. If we don't do that, the rule of law, which is the centerpiece of our society, which has made us great. I mean, talk to anybody from any country in the world that comes here to do business and eventually becomes a citizen. I don't care if they're from Turks and Anatolia, Chinese, Vietnamese, Indians, anybody from anywhere in the world will say, this is a wonderful country. This is a place where you can do business because you don't have to bribe everybody to do business. You don't have to bribe the plumber to fix the plumbing. You don't have to bribe the electrician to come and rewire the house. He'll work for a price and he'll do good work. His labor is golden. You know, that's what they'll tell you. Now that will go away if we don't enforce the law. These simple things we take for granted will be lost. It's not just the obvious Venezuelan gang criminals that are raping, assaulting, and murdering 11-year-old girls. It's not just that. We know that's a problem, and we ought to deal harshly with those people. They should be executed for what they do. Anybody that does that should be executed. We're not enforcing the law. We've grown soft. Everybody has it too easy, Stephen. You know, just look at the population. Everybody wanders down the mall, 20, 30, 40 pounds overweight, and continues to eat bad food, then rushes home to watch the game on TV. What are they worried about?
Not much. Yeah.
That kind of population doesn't revolt. It just dies out. Now, that can change, but it's not changing yet. But it's changing now in France, and it's going to change in the rest of Europe. And then suddenly people are going to say, what are we doing in Eastern Ukraine? The Russians aren't coming. The Russians don't want to invade Europe. You think Putin wants to manage the mess that exists today in Western Europe? Good God. The last thing he wants is to conquer and occupy Poland. It's full of Poles. They hate Russians. Why would you do that? It's stupid. It's not going to happen. He doesn't want to do it. Nobody does in Russia. They want to get back to doing business. And they would like to do business with us, but they can't because of these governments. They're horrible. And they've got to go away. And that was the whole point of let's hold elections early. The sooner we turn out this government and put new people in, the better. Everything will not change overnight, but you've got to put people in there that are not part of the problem. I think it was George Will many, many years ago has said, if I have a choice of staffing the government with the top minds at Harvard University and Yale, I would rather have the first 500 names in the phone book in Boston and take them and put them into government because they'll do a better job. And he wasn't wrong, because they're Americans that care about Americans. They're in touch with reality. We need people that are America first in a very positive sense, that they understand that everything stands or falls on the basis of what we do in our country, not what we're doing in the Middle East or Eastern Ukraine. Those places have been there for thousands of years. They get along quite well without us. And none of them want to come here and blow us up. That's nonsense. So we got to come around to understanding these things and focus on what we're doing here. And I think that's what most American voters are beginning to think, but they've got to operationalize it.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I do think a lot of people are waking up. This last week, I think, even opened a lot of Democrats' eyes that, wait a minute, the president is not, we're being lied to. We've been gaslit. We've been manipulated. Well, Colonel, I appreciate you coming on. This was a great discussion. I look forward to having you on again. Thank you. I hope your family has a nice 4th of July week, and we'll see you on the next show.
Same to you and everybody else. Bye-bye.